Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. This week, I'm speaking to the incredible Isabella Hammad, author of The Parisian and most recently, Enter Ghost. I love Isabella's work, which is always so thoughtful, beautifully written, multi-layered, and hugely informative and insightful. As a British Palestinian herself, Isabella tells stories of Palestinian families, enabling us to understand better Palestinian history, colonial projects, and what we are witnessing unfold in Palestine right now. At the time of recording this episode, towards the end of 2023, the most recent war on Gaza has been taking place for over 75 days, and the official death toll has crossed 20,000 people. Thousands are still trapped under rubble, and millions are also at risk from starvation, disease, and the cold. I'm so glad to be speaking to Isabella today, all about her work and about Palestine. Isabella Hammad was born in London. Her writing has appeared in Conjunctions, the Paris Review, the New York Times, and elsewhere. She was awarded the 2018 Plimpton Prize for Fiction and the 2019 O. Henry Prize. Her first novel, The Parisian, which was published in 2019, won a Palestine Book Award, the Sue Kaufman Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Betty Trask Award from the Society of Authors in the UK. She was the National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree and has received literary fellowships from MacDowell and the Lannan Foundation. Hello, Isabella. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It is so wonderful to have you here today. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I always like to ask my guests and people in general how they are. And I kind of feel like at the moment, it feels like an increasingly impossible question to answer. But still, I'd like to still ask it. How are you doing? Everything going on, and also bearing in mind, we're in the midst of British winter, which is never particularly nice anyway. But how are you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how I am. It's a pretty horrible time, so I'm maybe in some way better than I was. But yeah, it's a difficult moment, I think, for lots of us. I'm sure it is for you as well. It's a tough time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to, obviously, today, I want to talk about your novel, Enter Ghost. But before that, I just want to explore your sort of relationship with Palestine. And I know that you have made an effort over the years to go back to the West Bank regularly. I just want to understand a little bit about that.
Totally. Yeah, I didn't grow up going there. I went elsewhere in the Middle East, but it was always going to be a big deal to go for the first time. And I went after college. It was sort of like a major, I always knew it was going to be a major event, and it was going for the first time. And then since then, basically, I go every year. Basically, I kind of maintain my relationship with the place that way and try and spend sort of chunk of time every year there. And yeah, I mean, I think it's almost difficult to talk about my kind of that relationship with Palestine, given what's happening right now and how it really feels like we're in a major turning point, a major point of change in, I think it can't be overstated actually, in Palestinian history and also I think world history, because this is, I think, the first time in history we've seen a genocide happening live on television. And so everything, I'm sure our whole conversation will be coloured by this, as, rightfully. Yeah, I think that I obviously will hope I'm going next year. I hope I'm going next year back to Palestine.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I hope more of us that want to go also get to go.
Yeah.
And it's just, I'm interested in knowing from your perspective, like when you do go back, do you notice any particular change? Like how, I don't know, even in terms of like how it just feels, but also visually, like have you been noticing a difference over the years?
I think that's a really interesting question. And it is a sort of quite specific perspective when there's time away, like you see the changes because they're not happening incrementally. It's happened with a year, or whatever, kind of like 7 months or something. So yes, certainly. I remember having a sudden moment, maybe like 5 years ago, where I suddenly realized that the settlements that used to be when you're driving around the West Bank that are on the hilltops, they're close to the road. So quite rapid feeling of the land being swallowed up, of increasingly feeling the stranglehold on Palestinian towns, cities and villages in the West Bank, and this feeling that you're past, that the zones of so-called Palestinian sovereignty are getting smaller and smaller. That's definitely something. Sometimes I also wonder if sometimes those changes that I see have to do with changes in me as well. Like I also wonder if it has to do with me growing up, or when I go and I feel really bad, for example, or I feel like overwhelmed by my perception of the strength of the Israeli military control. Has it changed, or is it just that I'm seeing it more clearly than I did before, or I have less of that kind of, like, when you're young and you have this, you're very optimistic about change and, and people power and stuff. I still have faith in people power. But I think that there's some kind of more grayscale, seeing things more clearly maybe as well. And that has to do with me just getting older and more mature.
For sure. That's really interesting, because I sometimes think about how sometimes when you go back to a place, especially if you've been away for a while, things can sometimes seem smaller and they seem less magical than you remember them being, or less happy or whatever it may be. And I think obviously in part that is because of how you change, but perhaps also the role of memory and how we can kind of control in some ways our memory, and we kind of can almost change it to fit a certain narrative or a certain understanding of how we're perceiving the world at the time. But the other side of it, which is, I guess, how you feel about the Israeli military, for example, I think is also really interesting and probably very true. If we feel more strongly about something, I think we start to see that play out in different ways, more visually. So thank you for sharing that. And as you said, I think, the entire conversation today will be coloured by what is happening in Palestine and Gaza, and also in the West Bank at the moment. But I would love to hear about your journey as a writer, because you are an absolutely stunning writer. Like, your work is phenomenal, and you've written 2 really amazing books so far, and To Ghost came out earlier on this year. What has your writing journey been like?
Thank you. That's really kind. When I was young, I was a big reader as a kid, as most writers are big readers as kids, right? And always liked doing bits of writing, but I didn't feel very confident about writing. And I think that partly had to do with the kind of education I had in the UK. It's not entirely true. I did have great English teachers at high school who were encouraging of creative writing. But I think at university level, because I studied literature, I felt more inhibited or nervous about trying to write. That, first drafts are always rubbish. And also when you first start writing, it's not going to be great quality. You have to kind of learn the craft, and not really being in an environment where that was encouraged, or that seemed like a kind of a real option. I didn't feel very confident about it, but it had always been something I'd wanted to do. Specifically, I'd wanted to write the novel that ended up being my first novel from quite a young age. When I was a teenager, I'd wanted to write this novel about pre-Nakba Palestine. And then it was when I left college that I was like, hell with it, I'm going to give it a go, more or less. I could give you more details of that story, but I don't need to. But broadly speaking, at that point, I was like, I may as well try. And then I began to try, and I learned how to write scenes, and I learned how to do it from that point onward. So in a funny way, it was less like I wanted to be a writer. It was more like I wanted to write that book. And then writing that book made me who I am, made me a writer, made it the way in which I experience the world and what I do with my days.
So obviously the Parisian is, brilliant. So multi-layered, a real education, I think, as well, because I think I feel like there are more stories and resources available about sort of post-Nakba, post-1948, not often as much pre-Nakba, which is what you address and you explore in The Parisian. So how did you find the transition from writing the Parisian to writing Enter Ghost, which obviously is a lot more modern day. And what kind of, because obviously it wasn't as if you were told you had to write it, you decided to write it, it's your book. What drove that change?
Yeah, I mean, my first book took me about 5 years to finish, and at a certain point in writing a book, so I've experienced from the experience of writing 2 books. So there's a certain point at which the next book occurs to me. Like I'm writing one book, and I suddenly know what my next book will be. And this idea of theatre had started quite early on, so I'd started making little notes, like mixed in with my Parisian notes, other notes for this new novel, and then I kind of, it was actually really fun to switch from obviously stylistically they're quite distinct, but also I think that kind of prose wise it was a change for me to sort of experiment with different kinds of ways of making scenes. Basically, actually, it was like using different kinds of techniques, but also just kind of thematically to start exploring form in different ways. Obviously, the book is partly written in theatre shape, that kind of goes into play form, and to kind of explore my themes formally in a different way, in a way that I had done with the Parisian, but they were just like different toolkit. So it was a fun switch and challenging. It's always good to be challenged, I think, with a new piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Enter Ghost, I mean, I would love for you to just introduce your novel. I really like hearing how authors sum up their book. If you just tell us what Enter Ghost is all about.
Of course, yes. So the book is it's narrated by an actress called Sonia, whose sister lives in Haifa. And they've grown up in London, but returning to Haifa every summer, which is where their father is from. Their mother grew up in the Netherlands, but was the daughter of a refugee from the Galilee. And the novel opens, she's arriving in Haifa to stay with her sister. She's had a bad affair with the theatre director. She's feeling pretty depressed about her career. And pretty much as soon as she arrives, she gets drawn into a production of Hamlet in Arabic in the West Bank. And then the rest of the book is basically about putting on this play in the conditions under which Palestinians of different legal statuses and experiences live.
So I really enjoyed the novel. I really, really enjoyed it. And I am also I love going to the theatre. I've never ever thought of writing a play, but every time I go, I'm always just in awe at the amount of work that must be going on behind the scenes, and also the role of the director. But actually, before we get into maybe the intricacies of the novel, I want to talk a little bit about the role of art and creativity and storytelling. Especially what we're seeing in Gaza at the moment is a very clear targeting of writers and creatives. Musa Abu Taha was arrested, and we've seen that so many really revered and endeared Palestinian writers have been killed very recently as well. What do you think? I wondered if you could just reflect on the role that you think that art and storytelling and plays and creativity can play or plays in the Palestinian liberation movement, and can we really look at sort of the loss of that in anything other than being intentional as a way of limiting the stories that get taken forward?
Yeah, it's been very important in the Palestinian liberation struggle for decades, and one of the kind of greatest theorists of this relationship is Ghassan Kanafani, who was a revolutionary leader and also a really great writer. And he was killed so young, and if he'd lived, he would have been incredibly prolific, I'm sure, and would have graced us with amazing literary productions. And I really think that narrative making has been very important for the Palestinian people to tell their own stories, especially in the face of consistent attempts at erasure, at genocidal violence. One of the aspects of genocide is to erase culture, and we're seeing that systematically in the destruction of universities, in the destruction of cultural centres, in the assassination of writers, also in the destruction of places of worship. They are very, very linked. I think that the sense of communal identity, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, the sense of a shared language, the sense of shared imagery, these things are not to be underestimated. These things are very, very powerful, and the Israelis know that they are very powerful, and that's why they attack them, and that's why they must be preserved and looked after and championed.
Absolutely. I mean, I really, really enjoyed hearing you speak about that so eloquently just now, and have been thinking about it a lot recently, especially because I think, you know, sometimes we think about a society and we think about maybe like political leaders that are at the forefront of it. But if we really think about like the passing on of tradition and culture, and we think about what is told to the outside world, so much of that comes from writers. It comes from that's why we need places like libraries and archive institutes, which we have seen in recent weeks have been completely targeted and annihilated. And I just, it feels it's a very clear sign of genocide. As you said, it is definitely part of that erasure of getting almost rid of people from history. So in Enter Ghost, Sonia has come to stay with her sister Haneen, who lives in Haifa. Now, I think what I really liked about the novel was that you explored the many facets and the many different ways that Palestinian identity is playing out in Palestine and also in Israel at the moment. And so we have places like Haifa, which have Palestinian families still living there, but Haifa is now in modern day Israel. So this Palestinian-Israeli identity is really complex and very heavy. And I think we see it a lot in the book. We see it, there's a lot of questioning of, Haneen questions like, why am I still here? What am I doing? Should I even be here? And I just wondered what you wanted to explore with regards to that and what you wanted people to think about.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think it's an important point to remember, which perhaps is not widely known, but the Israeli state has never declared its borders. So according to them, all of it is Greater Israel. So the West Bank, they call Judea and Samaria. And as we know, they're already planning property development and offshore gas exploration in Gaza. So for them, all of it is will be part of their future state project. It's an expansionist ideology. So that's why my character, in Arabic, Palestinians will refer to the land that was taken in 1948 as usually as 48 or the inside, because in fact to call it, I mean, of course we can call it Israel proper or whatever, but the line is blurring. I think that's worth bearing in mind, that this is basically one state. It's just with all these different sort of legal mechanisms and military mechanisms in place in different areas, different civilian infrastructure. But so for a character like Haneen, she of all Palestinians, you could argue, has the most privilege or the most freedoms because she has an Israeli passport. She has the citizenship, and that bestows on her certain freedoms of movement, certain rights, although Palestinian citizens of Israel still are second or third class citizens within that society for a variety of different reasons, or different kind of covert and explicit modes of discrimination. But I kind of, in the character of Haneen, I guess because she teaches in the university, she sort of occupies this uncertain position where she's come back, unlike Sonia, who just didn't want anything to do with the Palestinian cause. She just decided to be a total individualist and become an actor in the UK and not have anything to do with it. Haneen really wanted to engage, and her way of engaging was to work in an Israeli institution. And then she starts to feel this position as actually really difficult to occupy and really challenging morally and kind of literally. So that's sort of one of the ways that the character of Haneen is grappling with her moral predicament. I really like the character of Haneen. I think she's actually one of the most sympathetic in the book. She's sort of not very expressive, and Sonia finds that difficult. But she's very principled, or she tries to be very principled at least. Yeah.
I also really like the character of Haneen. She, I guess, fits the older sister sort of model in many ways, but also just I think that she's just a really interesting character in how much she thinks, and how sort of careful she is about things, and also even in terms of how much she controls what she says to even her own sister. But one of the really interesting parts in the book, there's a part where the characters are, when they're rehearsing for the play, and Sonia begins asking people about, when did you have your political awakening? And she actually later on even asks her father, like, when did you have your political awakening? And I found that question so interesting, because I think about myself and I think I had a political awakening when actually, because of Gaza, I would say, back in 2008. And that was because I was doing my A-levels and I all of a sudden was just very interested in politics, and up until then just had not engaged in much outside of my own life, partly because I was a child, but maybe also because of, I had a very big extended family and, just very different circumstances. And I lived in a place where most people were not talking about politics or current affairs, so there wasn't that appetite. So I think about myself, but I also think that I have not been living in Palestine, or I have not been living in a conflict zone. And I just wondered do you think that if you have lived your entire life in a conflict zone, is there actually ever a moment of awakening, or is it just your complete normality and your existence and you don't know anything else?
I think that's a really interesting question. It makes me think of this story by Kanafani, actually, and I can't remember what the title of the story is. It's very short, and in it, a little boy says to his father, "Dad, am I Palestinian?" And the father says, "Yes, you are Palestinian." And it's like a stone falls on him, and he suddenly realizes, and that is like a moment of awakening to his condition. I think you can be in an environment in which you ambiently absorb political ideas, or you literally see things in your daily life if you're, for example, living under military occupation. But I think as even such a child who grows up in such an environment, there will still be moments where there are moments of understanding, even if they're seeing it on a day-to-day basis, where some pieces fit together and they start to see something for themselves, so that it's coming from themselves. I do think there is probably a distinction there, but it probably happens earlier, right, for those people, right? I mean, speaking for myself, I grew up in the UK and I was in a family that was very politicized, and I was very, conscious of being Palestinian and also confused and felt that I had to hide it. I would tell people I was Lebanese. Still lots of people from my childhood think I'm Lebanese. Yeah. They're sort of but quite confused, like a lot of sort of like badges saying Free Palestine around the house, kind of like sort of bits and pieces. But I felt that for me, belatedly in a sense, going there and seeing with my own eyes was when it was like, okay, now I see everything. Now I see everything, and I'm changed. But the groundwork had been laid there for my whole life.
I mean, my parents are not Palestinian. We are Pakistani, and I just remember actually at one point feeling like such a disconnect between some of the things that my parents had been holding on to about the things that they'd been through. And it almost felt like I just wanted them just to let go of it, because to me, that isn't my reality. And I wonder if your experience was somewhat similar, because you were trying to grow up in the UK, trying to understand your own identity, but were somewhat removed from the experiences that your parents and their parents would have had. And I just wonder if it was something similar to that.
So interesting. I don't know. I don't think I did experience that. I think I just wanted to know. I mean, that's why I started the book, where I started researching it when I was really young, when I was like 15. I started interviewing my grandmother, about the 1930s. Like I actually had wanted to know, like I wanted to understand. And I was really conscious that in the UK, there is no education about the history of the British Empire. And that is a large reason why I think, yes, the massive marches here for Gaza are really encouraging, but I also think it's muted as well. And I think that does, and people are afraid to speak. And I think that's because they don't have the education. They don't know their own history here, and they don't know that everything that's happened in Palestine is because of the British. It's because of them. It's actually the UK government's responsibility to rectify its crimes. And that knowledge is just lacking. So I think that I came to understand. I mean, reading was also like important for that part of my education, reading books and to understand the history of empire. But I think I had curiosity.
Yeah.
Would say.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think reading, and for the same reasons that you said about how we're not taught about actually what happened with the British Empire in schools and more broadly, it was only when I explored that did I understand more like who I am and where I come from. And now I'm so certain of my own identity, and also the role and the role that Britain plays in that, which is also a bit conflicting because I am living in Britain, so there's a confusion there, but also so much clarity. But I think you're definitely right. I mean, I think what I've been disappointed about is seeing people that, authors and other people that, you know, have been talking about colonialism and decolonization, but seem to have still muted themselves when it comes to Palestine. That is probably one of the most frustrating things that I've seen at the moment.
Yeah, I feel gravely disappointed, I think, exactly that, because this is sort of ways in which Palestine is like literally out of joint. You know, it's the last bastion in some ways, or one of the very last bastions, one of the most prominent final bastions of European colonialism, one of the residues of that history. And people are afraid to talk about it because it's happening now. And then later on, maybe they'll say, "Oh, I knew all along." Once it's a safe past fact, they'll be able to theorize about it and say they were on the right side of history, but they just didn't say anything at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting from that perspective as well, because we have in Palestine almost like a colonization after a colonization. So there hasn't been a period of self-rule, but there is a hesitancy to look at the role of Israel as that of a colonizer, and to have this idea that we live in a post-colonial world. You know, the British Empire has fallen, there's no colonialism anymore, France is out of wherever it was colonizing. But actually, it is, as you said, it is happening right now. And I just think that understanding is so important. And if people can almost like arm themselves with that knowledge, I think will bring such a shift in not only how we view what's happening, but how we feel we're able to talk about it as well.
I think it's also, at this point, we're talking about 20,000 massacred, but that's the figure. I mean, I haven't looked at the numbers this morning, but it's probably more like 30,000, counting the people under the rubble. We've also got people being starved, infectious diseases, there's no water. If these facts can't make people wake up to the reality of this ethno-nationalist state project, I really don't know what will.
Exactly.
And I think what's important is to enable people who do see but are afraid to speak, to enable them to speak. And it might be that they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the community, they're not brave enough yet. But I would say the world's majority can see it for what it is.
Yeah.
And it's just that the power in the world lies in the hands of a very few people in a handful of nations that dominate the world.
Yeah.
And I think we should see that clearly for what it is and what it means for our future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really scary. And I think one of the really heartbreaking things I've been seeing is when you hear some of the journalists and the Palestinians on the ground say things like, why is the world not doing anything? Why is the world so quiet? I think what I find so gut-wrenching about that is knowing that it is literally a handful of people that are controlling it. There are hundreds and thousands and probably millions around the world now that are out on the streets, but it is a handful of people that are controlling it, and it is very scary. And as you said, I think it tells us a lot about the world that we live in, and it's not too late to change and to fix up, right? Especially now.
It's a must. It's a must because This has huge implications for I'm not exaggerating. I don't think when I say this has huge implications for the future of our species. This is gravely serious that this is happening and that it hasn't stopped. And there is still not a ceasefire. This is gravely serious for our future. So I hope people keep it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to talking about Enter Ghost. And so the play that our actors put on in Enter Ghost is Hamlet. So why did you decide that you wanted these Palestinian actors to put on a Shakespeare play, and then why did you choose Hamlet?
Yeah, thanks. So I, first of all, the idea of theatre came first. Then I thought maybe I'll write a play. Maybe I'll do an Arabic play. I looked at a few playwrights. And then I thought, actually, it's quite good to do Shakespeare because although Shakespeare is British, he's also global. There's also a Soviet Shakespeare tradition. There are these other Shakespeare traditions. And also there are ways in which certain Shakespeare plays are so well known that they come close to cliche, even if they're known in a very bastardized, simplified way. Like everyone knows To Be or Not to Be, even if you don't know where it came from. You've heard To Be or Not to Be, right?
Exactly.
It signifies all sorts of things. It signifies a kind of a high blown rhetoric of kind of grandeur, theatrical grandeur. To be or not to be, it connotes literary seriousness, has all of these connotations. But I had initially thought I would do Macbeth and do all one of the plays that is traditionally or has a kind of around which a new post-colonial Shakespeare tradition has grown up, right? Where you have kind of talking back to Shakespeare, whether that's through Caliban or in The Tempest or one of the other characters that represents a dominated people by the West. But then I found out that Hamlet had been banned in the Israeli prisons in the first Intifada for being a text that incited to violence, which I thought was really interesting. That To Be or Not to Be is actually a very dangerous speech, to take arms against a sea of trouble and by opposing them. And then I found out that it had this other whole history in Egypt during the time of Nasser, when To Be or Not to Be was translated as Shall We Be or Not Be, often as a kind of newspaper slogan, meaning the we of the Arabs, the kind of coming to being, coming to historical consciousness on the world stage, the coming of the Arab nation. So with all of those different echoes, I felt like it was quite a good play to play around with, basically to mess about with. And because, I recognize it can still be a barrier to entry. People might think, I don't really know Hamlet very well, or I never studied it, or, but I'm hoping at least they know like a handful of things, like there's a ghost and, just like the basic things, so that they can get into the text and they can see where I'm making jokes and laugh, hopefully.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed it. I read Hamlet many years ago now, but I really enjoyed revisiting it through the book. And I thought there was a lot that was very clever. And actually one of my favorite parts of the book is when the actors are trying to decode whether they think, what they think the ghost is, what they think, is it Palestine? And they have this really animated conversation about that. And I just wondered, for you, what is behind the title Enter Ghost, and what do you think about the ghosts that I guess we all have?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't have that title when I was writing it. I wrote it under the title "Go Bid the Soldiers Shoot," which is the last line of the play. Okay. But I sort of knew that this would be vetoed by my editors and my agents, who were like, "This doesn't, no woman is going to pick this up." I think my agent said no woman will ever pick up a book with soldier in the title. So Enter Ghost is a much more saleable title. Sort of sounds mysterious, but I think it works. I like that it pulls out ghosts throughout the book. So people then are looking for ghosts. I think it works well, and I like that, and I like the resonance. But obviously there are lots of different ghosts in the book. There are the ghosts of the previous generations. There are the ghosts of parents. There are the ghosts of grandparents. There are Palestinians as ghosts who haunt the Israelis, the return of the repressed. So that kind of is something I could also play around with without, I kind of like, the way the actors, as you say, debate about how to allegorize Hamlet to represent Palestine, and the director is like, no, we don't want it to be like a too simple a one-to-one allegory. It can resonate, but we don't want it to be didactic in this way. So this sort of battle, which is also sort of joke about Palestinianizing all artwork, I think. So, but in the same way, I guess for myself as a writer, I also didn't want. I was a bit like Mariam. Like I didn't want it to be two, that there is one ghost. For more it to be something that kind of imbues the text, that evokes certain things, that pairs together things you might not ordinarily pair together, that makes the mind work in more lateral ways, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was so clever, and I mean, I could almost tell that it would have been quite fun for you to like play around with that and explore different things. And I also really like the character of Mariam. I think she's so great. Really interesting and really strong-willed as well. I do love her. But I want to explore the sisters. So we have Sonia and we have Haneen. What were you really interested in bringing out really about their relationship? Like, what was important to you to bring across about these two people? I'm
not sure that I approach characters with that in mind. I don't think I come to them with, I want to draw this out. I think I was interested in sisters, and that might be because I don't have a sister, and I maybe always wanted a sister and thought, well, maybe I'll just write a book that's sort of about sisters and I can explore sisterhood and what that means. And obviously the whole book in many ways is about the relationships among women, and different kinds of being a sister or being a mother, in fact, the ways in which sisters end up mothering each other, as Haneen does for Sonia. So Haneen is like Sonia's mother in some ways, as her older sister. But as I wrote the book and as I defined the characters in opposition to each other, it became quite clear that Sonia and Haneen had defined themselves almost in distinction to the other, that they had taken decisions because their sister had gone one way, they had gone another way. And I think that can be true of siblings in general. You know, when you think about the family unit and how you come to be as a person, I don't know if you've got siblings or if you've experienced that, you do, there is a kind of unconscious perhaps or conscious comparison among siblings, and sometimes they copy each other.
Sure.
And sometimes they go their own way. They say, well, they did that, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. And that becomes a kind of actual central force in identity formation. I sometimes think when, people, in the diluted way in which people deal in psychoanalytic ideas, I feel like there's an overemphasis on the parents and the ways that your mother and father and how they abandoned you or smothered you or whatever. But these things are how your neuroses are formed. But actually, I think that siblings play a really big role. They're also there when you're a kid, or they suddenly appear partway through childhood and screw everything up. So I think I just wanted to kind of play with that and see what my characters did when I put them under those conditions.
So I mean, I have one sister. I have a brother also, but I have one sister, and we are quite different, I think. Although when people meet us, they think that we're very similar, but I think we're very different. And also, like, we're 8 years apart, so we have this like almost like a life difference. For a lot of my growing up, I kind of felt like we weren't on the same page. Now that I'm in my like early to mid 30s and she's in her early 40s, I kind of feel like we're on a similar page now, I guess. But for so long, we just weren't. And I really liked seeing that in some ways play out with Sonia and Haneen as well, just to show that like how difficult it can be just to sometimes have a conversation, and how difficult it is to really say what you want to say and to ask the questions that you want to ask, and especially if you feel left out, because there were parts in the book where Sonia felt like Haneen had hidden things from her or not told her or forgotten about her, and just to see that playing out on the page was really interesting.
I was just going to say, I think that's also definitely when you grow up with someone, you have certain ways of relating to each other, or you develop, or when you've known someone for a really long time, and sometimes it can be hard to say the truth or to kind of find new ways of relating to each other. It's like your brain just goes along this one track. Oh, this is how I react to my dad or whatever, or this is how I sort of respond. I go into this mode and they go into that mode, and these are the roles we play, and it can be hard to break through and actually talk about something directly. Yeah,
absolutely. And I also, what you just said also before about parents and how sometimes even like among women and with sisters, one might end up in like a mothering type role. And I never thought about if that is because we experience being parented, and if we kind of feel like that's what we need to do. I don't know. But there is part of Sonia's story is that she doesn't have any children and she's had baby loss and then struggling with fertility. And I just, as someone that has been through that myself, I guess I appreciated to see that on a page, in a book. We don't see nearly enough of that. But I just wondered if you could just talk about why you felt that was an important part of Sonia's story.
Definitely. So I kind of, the theme of motherhood was very important from the beginning, and in part because I wanted to, I kept coming at it from quite a kind of cerebral standpoint. I was interested in, and political standpoint, I was interested in the role, quote unquote, that women play in the Palestinian struggle. And that role, in iconography, has always been the mother of the fighter, brought largely the mother of the fighter, which is a bit like Mary, the mother of Christ, the martyr. You know, the sort of like similar iconography. The fighter goes out, you give them their bread and za'atar or whatever. You know, this kind of thing. And partly knowing so many strong Palestinian women, I was like, well, this is so interesting. Sort of this iconography. Is there a new iconography, or could there be new kind of ways of imagining the role of political women? And that was sort of where the idea of the mother came in, through that angle. And then I chose Hamlet, and then I was like, well, then Sonia should play the mother character, and she should be struggling with that role, the role of the mother, which is also a role that, even if you're not in a political struggle, is something that women have to contend with, whether it's absence or its presence, as a choice or not a choice, either way, because that's what society expects of women. Even if you have completely broken the formula, or you say, I don't care about that, I don't want kids, you still are contending with this paradigm socially. We haven't got rid of that.
Yeah.
So that was something that kind of entered into Sonia's life. And it became clear at a certain point in the writing that should involve a concrete experience of loss, rather than a kind of abstractly, this is the path I didn't take. It should actually be, no, she actually experienced wanting to be a mother, and she thought she was going to be a mother. So that's where it entered in there.
Yeah. And how does that also link to or relate to Sonia and Haneen's relationship with their own mother, who is largely absent from the book? To be honest, at the beginning, I wondered if she wasn't alive anymore. And then there was a bit where she was talking, Sonia was talking about her day, and she was like, oh, I called my father and then I called our mother, and I was like, oh, okay, she's still alive. Why, you know, in wanting to explore motherhood and the role of women, to then have our main character's mother to be so absent from the story.
Yeah, so their strongest relationship ends up being with the father, because the mother left them. So they in fact were left by their mother, which I think, now that I think about, and I found myself actually, I think about my characters in this way, rather than they almost at a certain point developed opacity, so that I could think aspects of them, and this miraculous thing of inventing characters were kind of like completely consonant with each other, and as though they were real. But it seems it's in that mode, I'm going to make this comment, it seems correct to me that the mother should be absent, so that they don't really have a model for being, you know, neither of them are mothers. They haven't actually taken this path, or they have had a kind of mixed relationship with the idea of motherhood. And I think that does have to do with their relationship with their mother, who was quite absent and who wanted to pull them away from Palestine. She herself had a kind of complex relation, or kind of difficult relationship with Palestine, and yes, so she's sort of ghostly, she's sort of not really there. And that's partly why the older sister then becomes Sonia's maternal figure. She's the one who Sonia returns to, wanting to be sheltered when she's in trouble, without realizing that Haneen herself needs some care.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really interesting. And I mean, and you said that you used the word ghost, which I hadn't thought about it, but in some ways their mother is quite ghost-like throughout the book, because she's there, but they have these questions also about her. Like, there's at one point Sonia asks Haneen, like, you know, why does she think that their mother married their father? And I found that so, like, you know, your sister's not really going to know the answer to that question, but it felt like such an important question for Sonia to try and understand everything that's going on in the way, and just in the way that ghosts do haunt us, and they force us sometimes to think about the things that we've locked away and we've just sort of like pushed to the back of our mind. So that's really interesting. So the book is basically like a a play within a book. That's right, a play within a book. But it's also like a play within a play. So we've got the actors are performing Hamlet, but then the book we have bits of their own interactions that are written out like a play.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm very interested in understanding why you decided to go with the form in the way that you did and what it was like for you exploring that.
Well, I definitely wanted to play with form when I started it. I wanted to explore theatricality and performance and roles formally. So I sort of knew I would do it at some point. And then it became almost automatic when they started rehearsing, in part because there were so many characters in the room that it was actually became a technical way to have everybody speak without all of those sort of clogging ligaments of then he put his cup down or whatever, the kind of like, I didn't need to sort of have that or the sort of balance of prose and dialogue, of stock prose and dialogue. And it also did this other thing that I really liked, which was it made Sonia, who by that point had become in the first person, I'd started the book in third person, but it gave me this break from being stuck in Sonia's perspective, and she just became another one of the speakers. So there was sort of leveling of all of the speakers into one. And I like that effect. I like what that suggested about being part of the team of the play, that they were all in it together in this sense.
Yeah, I did like that you were able to bring forward other characters almost to like the main stage of the book without having to switch perspective, because I have read a lot of books that switch perspective and I do quite enjoy them, but I think I liked the fact that this was just one perspective. It gave it a continuity, but at the same time you were able to bring forward other characters in that way. So I think it's so good. There's a bit in the book, and I have heard you have spoken about it before as well, where one of the characters says, every family has a Nakba story. And I just wondered if you could just reflect on that sentence.
Well, it's true. Every family has a Nakba story, right? Much of our understanding of the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, is passed down through oral histories. There are some great projects, actually, some great oral history projects. There's one happening at the American University of Beirut where they have recorded a huge number of oral histories about the Nakba and put them online. I think this is so important and so valuable, especially as our grandparents' generation pass away, or people who witnessed it. That generation is being lost and those memories are being lost. It's so important to preserve it as a kind of act of witnessing. And obviously now we're having another Nakba, or if the Nakba ever stopped, indeed, I think there's also a growing understanding of the Nakba as a framework, as an ongoing project of erasure, which began in 1948 or in 1947, in fact, and which has never really stopped. But certainly, I think thinking Palestine through the lens of family is it's true. I think it's sort of real. That's how we understand it, is through our families, especially those of us in diaspora. That's very important to understand it through the lens of our families. Somebody said, an Egyptian said to me, when she was with me and a group of other Palestinians, she said, "You guys are always talking about family trees. You're always asking from what village someone is from, or what family are they? They're related to this person, related to that person." I was like, "Oh God, we're so awful." She was like, "No, it's because you're a diasporic people. These things are very important. You latch onto family trees. It's a people that's been fractured. So these things become very important. This sense of where you're from here, and then you went there. My grandparent was from there, and I don't know that people in other countries talk about their great grandparents so much. So I feel like this is actually very important for an affirmation of sense of belonging, a sense of self, and a sense of a collective sense of self that is resisting erasure."
Yeah, I mean, I think it's amazing, really, to kind of know your own history as far back as a lot of Palestinians do. I can't really tell you anything concrete about my family before my grandparents, and I can just tell you that my grandparents moved from Pakistan to the UK, and I have been asking my parents and I have been asking my aunts and my uncles, but so much of the history is just lost, it's just gone. And I have this like very like a basic story that I have dated to 1920, but I don't know if it is even 1920, that my ancestors came from Kashmir, but what is now Indian administered Kashmir. They came from there into Pakistan, and then there were 5 brothers that all moved to different villages, and that's how that's how my family, I guess, and the community has sort of developed. And then in the 70s, my grandparents and also my parents at the same time moved from Pakistan to the UK. So I have this, but it's a very vague story. I can't tell you any names. I can't tell you the names of any more villages apart from the ones that I have visited. It's very, very vague. And actually, I really sometimes feel that loss. I feel that absence, and I have tried to fill it in, but there's just no way for me to find that information because everybody that I knew is no longer here. And so I'm always in awe of people that have that history. I think it's so powerful and so important to know that. And also when it helps a lot to build community, because not to the same extent, but definitely when I meet somebody that's also from Pakistan, if they say the name of an area that I'm aware of, immediately my interest is further piqued, and I start asking, "Oh, do you know this person, that person?" I think it's a very natural thing, but it's really important in community and kind of building that sense of, I don't know, family as well. I recently read a piece in The Guardian that was published, an exchange between yourself and Sally Rooney. I think it was The Guardian, right?
Yeah, it was in The Observer. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was I think it put words to a lot of the things that a lot of us are feeling at the moment. But you also, one of the things that you talk about is the fact that it's been a PR war since 1948. But that is exactly the line that's actually taken from Enter Ghost. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that based on the importance to keep talking and the importance that words and language and generally sort of making noise and raising awareness has right now.
Yeah, I heard the other day I heard the writer Muhammad al-Kurd say in Palestine they are subjected to genocide, but here, and he was speaking in London, we are at war. And I think that it is really important to, I mean, people know this already, but to reaffirm the fact that Israeli apartheid is sustained by international complicity, specifically of the US, the UK, France, and Germany. And that means that the manufacturing of the consent of the taxpaying public plays a key role in sustaining that system. So that's where language is very important, and that's where the role of mainstream publications actually also is really large. Like the New York Times plays a huge role in this war, and that is they bear a huge moral burden, in fact. Yeah, so it can't really be understated. I think sometimes you can feel like, oh, I'm stuck in this discursive war so far away from where actually people are being killed every minute, and so it feels like why are we fighting about words when that's happening, when people are being massacred? It sort of seems so detached or something, but it's not. The things are related. They directly relate to the war machine in a frighteningly direct route. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think one of the things that I have taken a lot of my time actually over the last few months is expressing frustration at the use of words chosen by people of influence, by big mainstream news outlets like the BBC, like the New York Times. If you use a set of words to describe deaths in Israel, for example, and you're using a different set of words to describe deaths in Gaza, but the words that you're using imply blame, or they imply a lack of innocence, or they imply hatred, you are fueling the machine. It is part of the narrative. It is the thing that is legitimizing what is going on. And it's so important to get, as you say, to get the terminology right. And so I'm so grateful for all the work that you're doing and that so many other people are doing to just keep the conversation going in the way that it needs to be going. And so how long did it take you actually to write Enter Ghost? It took you 5 years to write The Parisian, right? How long did it take you to write Enter Ghost?
About 3.5
Okay.
to 4 years. Yeah, with edits. Yeah.
Okay, that's still quite a long time.
Yeah.
And how did you feel? Like, did your like when I guess after 3.5 years, once you'd finished writing it, did you feel like you were you had done what you had set out to do 3.5 years ago, or did you feel somewhat different towards the text?
No, I think I broadly, with both books I've written, kind of knew what I wanted, so that I mean, obviously, there are always faults in a text. It's never perfect. I think somebody said a novel is a long piece of writing with something wrong with it. There's always something kind of, they're baggy pieces of writing. But broadly, I knew what I wanted to do, and I didn't really change plan. I kind of figured out how to get there, more or less. Yeah. And
what do you hope for anyone that picks up Enter Ghost?
I hope that it makes people think deeply about lives other than their own.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And Isabella, it has been so wonderful speaking to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Samia.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.